Welcome back to Kaleidoscope. I'm Daisy Cousins. Well, as I've said earlier in the show, the gender wars continue to rage, and we are very fortunate tonight to have another warrior on the front lines of the gender wars with us this evening, the wonderful Mary Harrington, who is a self-proclaimed reactionary feminist. I rather like that term. She is an author and she is the contributing editor at Unheard, and she is here with us tonight to give her equally valuable take to the wonderful Sal Grover on these legal issues that we are dealing with now, thanks to gender ideology infiltrating politics, the courts, and law generally. Mary, welcome to the program. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Well, it's lovely to have you. And you are an author, of course. You had a book published last year called Feminism Against Progress, in which you warned feminists that they may not be making as much ground as they think, and only a skeptical feminist can truly protect women's rights in this day and age. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. The argument of the book was that if we assume that progress is always towards more freedom and always towards more stuff, so more material progress, more individual liberation, you reach a point where, for women in particular, you're scraping the barrel, and actually more liberation comes to mean liberation from our bodies. And really, we're pretty much 50 years into that trajectory at this point. We've been trying to liberate ourselves from having bodies, more or less, for the best part of 50 years through various different medical technologies. And we've now reached the point where people have come to believe that they have a political right not to have a sex, or to choose their sex, or to alter their sex, or to be recognized as neither sex in law, as though biological sex were an oppressive imposition from outside and not something that just is. And as a consequence of that, we're now seeing negative impacts from what really began as a feminist movement, but upon women themselves. And of course, as you've seen, as you've just spoken to Sal Grover, who really is at the sharp end of that, in contesting the incursion of men into her women only app that she founded. But there are countless other more literal incursions of men into women's spaces, whether you are talking about changing rooms, or we're talking about prisons, or we're talking about sports. There are practical places where our bodies are not just an optional bolt-on that we can modify as we see fit. They're just a basic foundational fact of who we are. And in ways which leave women vulnerable in specific ways. Our physiology makes us less physically strong, which means that we can't compete in sports on equal terms with men. You see that, for example, in the parkrun, amateur running movement in the United Kingdom, where there's a really bitter contest afoot between the parkrun organisers who believe that they should be inclusive and should therefore allow men to run in the women's category if they identify as women, and the women who run in the women's category and say, hey, this isn't fair because we've now got men who are winning park runs or breaking supposedly women's records all over the place, and it's bumping everyone down the rankings. And of course then you get male sports writers say, hey, it's just an amateur competition, why can't you just be kind? And all these women are like, no, so do you. No, excuse me, this is my hobby which I enjoy, this is my hobby which I take seriously, even though I'm never going to be Paula Radcliffe. How dare you say I have to lose my rankings and lose the opportunity of a top spot that I train really hard for and that I'm really passionate about, just because I'm never going to be an Olympic runner? How dare you? And so this is, and then there's a court case in the United Kingdom where some nurses in a primary care NHS hospital have been compelled by their employer to make space in their changing room for a man who identifies as a woman. And they've been told that they are obliged to be inclusive, quote unquote, to this man who wants to get dressed around them. And I mean, in an NHS environment, you're changing under pressure. You can't really all go and hide behind curtains and be modest and be, you're just in a hurry, and you need to be very practical and very sort of quick about doing the things that you need to do to get in and out of your scrubs or whatever it is. And these women, these nurses, are saying this is just outrageous. We shouldn't be compelled to change around a man and then told that we're the bad guy for saying that this is inappropriate. And then there have been court cases in prisons. I mean, in America, in some US states, it's really bad. There have been cases of women being impregnated in jail. Now, single-sex prisons was a founding feminist cause in the 19th century. The women's movement, figures like Josephine Butler, and there were other social reformers in the 19th century, really the very first wave of feminism. Even before anybody got to demanding the vote, there were feminist movements which were dedicated to saying, no, actually sex matters, and there are laws and regulations and social norms that need to change in order to keep women safer. And one of those was a campaign for public conveniences that were segregated by sex, such that women could actually leave the house for more than, they could travel more than half an hour from home without being desperately vulnerable should they need the bathroom. So these were civic-minded reform campaigns, dedicated to giving women more ability to be free and to be equal participants in public life. And another one of these campaigns was for sex segregation in prison, because prison reformers, and the social reformers who tackled these issues would look at it and say, no, this is horrendous. Men and women are being lumped into jails together, and then they lock the door and walk away. And I mean, you can imagine the kind of horrors which are then perpetrated on the women. I know, it doesn't even bear thinking about.
No.
And this was an absolutely basic kind of ground zero women's rights issue in the 19th century, that prisons should be sex segregated, because let's face it, men are one shape and women are another shape, and men have certain urges, and not all of them are able to control those urges. And I think it's probably reasonable to assume that among the criminal population who have done something bad enough to end up in prison, there's probably a higher proportion of those who are not able or willing to control their urges. Therefore, women and criminal men should not be locked up with women. This just seems so self-evident, you ought to be able to see it from space. However, in American prisons, should those men decide that today they feel like a women, in some states they're now just routinely housed in the women's prison because inclusivity. Now, and I'll tell you something else, Daisy, just specifically on the subject of men who identify as women and then end up in prison. I discovered recently a fascinating statistic. Wherever the prison populations of trans-identified men has been studied, it turns out that a really shockingly high proportion of those men are sex offenders. And to be clear, I'm not making a general statement here about, I'm not qualified to make a general statement about men who identify as women and their proclivities. But of that subset that ends up in prison, an astonishingly high proportion, something like 50%, and this is consistently the case wherever it's been politically possible to look at the statistics of trans-identified men in prison, around 50% of them are sex offenders. And now, when you map that onto the reality of women's physiological vulnerability, and you see, okay, so consistently 50% of incarcerated trans-identified men are sex offenders. Is this really a population? Do we really want to be locking a population which has a very high probability of being perverts of some kind?
Yes,
it's the pervert to women's prison pipeline. It's completely insane.
It's
yet
bonkers.
It's happening in the name of inclusivity.
Yeah, it is.
It's completely insane.
It's completely insane, and I'm happy to always talk about this issue because it is just so weird. And as for the statistic about sex offenders, I've seen that too, and I think it's also possibly likely that men who are sex offenders and don't actually believe they're women just really like the idea of being in a women's prison. So we'll just opportunistically identify as women so they can get into a women's prison and kind of go nuts, which is equally as bad because it means these new laws have just facilitated potentially sex offenders to just satisfy their urges carte blanche. I mean, it's insane that this is being allowed to go on, like for so many reasons. It's a hideous human rights abuse.